narratives of Arabic and Arabic American people. His writings have been featured in several publications, and he has also held performances and conversations to share his works. So welcome, Anes Ahmed. We are all eager to listen to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone else, for joining me here today. I'm very excited to just nerd out a little bit about literature and creative writing, because for me, this type of field has been something that is deeply personal and it's very intimate. Because to me, storytelling is a field where it explores so many avenues of life. And because of this, I am very much looking forward to chatting a little bit more with you all about this. And the way how I envisioned today would play out would be I would kind of discuss about myself a little bit, about what drew me into literature, into creative writing, and then I'll try to segue into a little bit more about my influences and the types of literature, especially global literature, that I enjoy reading, because I believe reading a lot of books is a great teacher. It's a great teacher for you as a writer. And then afterwards, I actually have a presentation set where I'm going to be reading some excerpts of some works that I've been working on. It's not the full works themselves, but I believe it gives like a good introduction to the types of works and ideas and themes that I focus on. And then afterwards, I'll try to give some advice about some writing, about publications, and about careers within the field itself. And then in the end, I'll try to do a Q&A with you all, and I'd love to have a conversation with you all about any questions or any ideas that you guys want to discuss about. And so let's get right into it. So for me, literature is this great wide field and has a great scope in where it focuses on the lives of people. And to me, I've always viewed literature as this avenue where it intersects philosophy, psychology, and languages of all sorts into this great and mythical story. And to me, I think that this great story that we all could get involved with is something that is quite fascinating and it's quite intimate. And for me, I think that intimacy starts with my love of language. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. And so for me, I first found my love of language right here at Sesame Street. When I was young, when I was at the age of 5, I was still learning English. And at this time, my mother and my father, they immigrated from Egypt to America right before I was born. And so they came to America, living in New York, living in Brooklyn, not really understanding English. They did not have the conversational understanding of it, and they only spoke Arabic. And so to me, when I was growing up, I kind of had this weird, I still like at a weird bypass of both English and Arabic at the same time. And for me, my mother and I would sit down and take notes when we were watching Sesame Street. And Sesame Street is the show in which it teaches children the vocabulary, the grammar, and the vocalizations of the English language to help them learn just the basic grasp of it. And to me as a child, it was very interesting to see my mother sitting down and just taking notes, trying to perfect the language that she did not really understand. And while at the same time, she would try to teach me the language through her Arabic. And so I kind of stood at this weird pass where I was trying to learn English and Arabic at the same time. And I was in this weird space of bilingualism that I wasn't sure how to handle at the time. But looking back at it now, I realized that this bypass of sorts kind of helped me shape the identity of my career as a writer. Because to me, I never viewed language as something, as a commodity. I never viewed it as something that is just like, you're just supposed to speak it only in conversation. In a way, because I was learning English and Arabic at the same time, I was able to view language as an act of survival, in the sense that me and my mother, we both needed to speak English to really survive in New York, to survive in Brooklyn. And so for me, learning Sesame Street, and just being a child trying to grasp the language itself, two languages at the same time, it has been something very powerful for me. And that's where my roots of creative writing and my passion for literature started. It was the start of my understanding of language as a whole. And so later on, when we jump forward a little bit, a few years in the future, when I was in high school, I was in this type of moment where I did not understand what I wanted to pursue. There were so many possibilities, and my parents, they naturally wanted me to enter a career within, let's say, law, as being a lawyer, or a career as a doctor or a high school teacher, just something that is practical and that could pay the bills. And so for me, during this time, I was still trying to discover myself and the passions that I had. And I kind of found myself just falling in love with literature. And but the big issue at this time with me in literature was that the readings that I was assigned at during school, during high school, they were all focused on European stories. And so I sat down reading the stories, and many of them are great. But the issue is that I couldn't really understand my space within literature at this time. I never read stories about Arabic characters, about Arabic stories, about stories that happened in Egypt to now. And for me, just not understanding that space, I kind of wanted to fill that in. I wanted to pursue writing, whether it was in the form of poetries or plays or fiction. I wanted to find some way to fill in that space so that I could have stories that represent the lives of Egyptians and Egyptian Americans. And at the same time, I wanted other people to also view those stories and to be inspired by them. I think that was one of the great motivators at that time. But I didn't really know how to do that. I did not have someone I could look up to that could really teach me. And also, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. And so my father at this time, he noticed this. And instead of telling me just to, like pursue like another career, he instead introduced me to this collection of books by the author Naguib Mahfouz. And this to me was a great and pivotal moment in which I really discovered myself as a reader and as a writer. Naguib Mahfouz, he is a Egyptian writer of short stories, of fiction, and sometimes of like journalistic pieces. But Naguib Mahfouz himself, I found myself within his writing. He spoke a lot about the existential situations of Egyptian Americans, sorry, not Egyptian Americans, just Egyptians, Egyptian society, and he really was able to bring to life Egypt. And as someone who has only read the European works till this point, like the works of Shakespeare, of Edgar Allan Poe, of Walt Whitman, just coming across Naguib Mahfouz was something of an awakening to me. I found this as something very powerful and as something that I really wanted. It taught me what I wanted to pursue within writing. And I began to just devour all of Naguib Mahfouz's works. I began to read all of his writings. I began to watch some of his interviews, and I felt very inspired by what he was trying to do. And what he was trying to do was to tell the Egyptian story as a story that we all could relate to. And I found this powerful and moving. And so I found myself right now so inspired that I began to pursue, in the beginning, I began to pursue poetry as a way for me to tell Egyptian and Egyptian American stories. And I admittedly, in the beginning, I wasn't quite well at writing stories, especially poetry. Looking back at some of my work now, I would find it a little bit corny, like some lines needed some work. But I think to me, though, the important thing was taking that first step, was that I was willing to enter the field of creative writing and literature and to really interact with this space. And to me, what I learned during this time was that it takes practice. Like no one's gonna write, like a great story or a great poem, a great piece of literature just right away. It takes a lot of patience and persistence, and sometimes it even takes resistance to just be able to learn how you encompass the spaces that you fill in, especially within this field. And so during this time, I began writing poetry, and I began writing, and I slowly started to seep into fiction a little bit more. And as I entered college, I decided at this point that I wanted to pursue a major within creative writing and literature. Because to me, I believe that this was a space in which I wanted to fill, and it was a space in which I believe it was necessary for me. It was, in a way, I know it sounds a little cliche, but in a way, it was kind of my calling of sorts. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next page, please. And so during my time in college, I was trying to find ways in which um, I was trying to find influences, people to look up to, people to mentor my work, to help me really develop it. And so during my time in college, I was able to meet a bunch of great professors who, in a way, kind of broadened my scope of literature. Uh, Instead of just reading European works and just Egyptian works, they introduced me to the whole orchestra of creative writing. And I remember that one of the pivotal moments for me was getting introduced to this poem called We Real Cool. This poem was written by Gwendolyn Brooks, who is a African American author, and she's a poet, and she was able to bring out a sense of me, uh, just the rhythmic schemes of poetry, of the simplicity of it, and the way how just few words could move a person. And if you all wouldn't mind, I would like to recite this poem to you all, titled We Real Cool. We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. The pool players, 7 at the golden shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. This poem to me was something very powerful. It was something so simple, and yet at the same time, there was so much meaning behind it. At this time, I was growing up. I grew up in Brooklyn, and I saw myself within this poem. I found myself relating to the story. I saw the kids that I grew up with, uh, especially within school, and I saw them within this poem. I saw how they lurked late after school, how they thought that they were so cool, and just the way that they interacted, I was able to relate so greatly with this poem. And to me, I felt very inspired, and I decided to write a poem myself in response to it. And instead of just, and within this inspiration, I kind of wanted to follow a similar rhythmic scheme, a similar type of metric, something that I was able to give homage to Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, but at the same time, trying to encapsulate what made me relate to this poem so much. Um, Now, if I'm able to share screen right now, let's see if I'm able to do this. Let's see. Sorry, give me one moment. I'm just trying to figure this out. And we click this. So I think you all should be able to see it. So this is a poem, and I think to me, this poem really alternated really shaped my understanding of how I try to write my poems. And this was one of the biggest shifts to me. And so, in response to Gwendolyn Brooks's poem called We Real Cool, I wrote a poem called Street Uniform. And instead of just taking just general spaces as Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, because that could be filled in anywhere, Street Uniform takes place in Brooklyn, and I really wanted to represent the kind of students, the kind of kids that I grew up with, to see if I was able to, in some way, uh, bring honor to Gwendolyn Brooks's memory in her poem, while at the same time trying to give homage to this place where I grew up in, which is Brooklyn. And so I'm going to recite the poem, and here's how it goes. Street Uniform for Gwendolyn Brooks. Those midnight boys roll down Brooklyn in the dance of smooth chords and thin gin. In Bay Ridge, our 7 plant bullets in the soil of graffiti bricks. They've been lurking to the tune of Shakur and Owen Sin. Those midnight boys are rolling down Brooklyn. They're real cool, you know. Their art of snatching prey from unpaved streets, cruising stolen skin to Prospect where our 7 plant jazz in. Mornings, boys leave high school during recess. Gathering at the shovel, our pool players begin striking matches and plans to roll down Brooklyn. It's dead late soon. Our 7 boys, filling the air in straight methane, begin to lose their grins on the highway. Our 7 plant their blood in. In June, the palebearers carried 7 coffins into ground to the song of organs and tearing kin. At Bay Ridge, our 7 planted bullets in. Now our midnight boys roll down in Brooklyn. This poem at this time was very personal to me. And to me, it taught me a lot about where I wanted, how I wanted to shape my poetry at the time. It taught me what type of rhythmic scheme that I wanted to focus on, while at the same time, it helped me just really understand that I wanted to put my work and my efforts within poetry as much as I can. And to me, this kind of evolved in my mind that writing and literature, in a way, it's kind of a doorway. It's an entryway of representation, of authentic stories, and of the personal. The stuff that you necessarily would not know, of me if you just saw me. But after reading that poem, it kind of shows in a way that I grew up around these kids in Brooklyn, and that these spaces, these environments, are deeply personal to me. And so this is how I want to shape my poetry. But at the time, I still wanted to find other ways in which I could pursue writing, because to me, I have this bad habit in which I kind of want to do a lot of things at the same time. And so I found myself in the beginning writing a lot of poetry, and then elsewhere I wanted to begin writing plays. And I wasn't sure how I was going to enter the space, because prior to this, I don't think I had too much of a background within acting, within playwriting. I actually think at this time too, I did not really watch. I didn't even watch a single play within theater. And so for me, I did want to experiment with the form as much as possible, because I do believe, at least for me, my type of writing style tries to incorporate fragmentation within it. And the point of fragmentation is that, to me, I try to bring out this type of idea of memory, and how this type of idea of memory shapes for me is through the art of fragmentation. It's kind of breaking up your pieces as much as possible, so that it doesn't give the whole scope of what's happening, but it gives the essential moments of what's happening within a story. And so for me, I entered my junior year of college within university, and I really wanted to experiment within my writing. And so I began to write plays. If I'm able to share screen again, let's see. And so, tab. Okay, so you all should be able to see my screen. There we go. And so at this time, I wanted to actually focus my work on the story, on a type of story that takes place in Egypt. And for me, I did not, honestly, I did not know how I was going to do this in the beginning. Uh, but my father approached me and he told me, Anes, there's a story that I heard about this fisherman in Egypt. And in Egypt, there's something called fish smuggling. And what happens is that if someone is able to smuggle fish, uh, because like the main place where fish would be fished at is at a place in Egypt called Aswan. And in Aswan, if you're able to secure a bunch of fish and were able to smuggle it into the other regions of Egypt and try to avoid the taxes of that, you would be able to get a lot of money, and like an absurd amount of money. And he told me the story about this politician who, before he was a politician, he used to smuggle fish, and he did this so seamlessly and he did this so effectively that he was able to get enough money to bribe his way into government. And I found the story in the beginning so out there and so like, I'm pretty sure my father told me the story in passing, but that story in a way kind of rooted in my mind because it was so fascinating for me because I've never heard of the process of fish smuggling before. And I think especially with writing, it's very important to find inspiration in places where you really don't see it coming at, where you really don't see it coming. But after my father introduced me to the story, I went to my room and I began to do research. I began to read as many news articles of this as possible. I began to watch Al Jazeera and some of the documentaries focusing on the lives of the fishermen who are living on the Nile because they have to in order to survive. And I found this so fascinating that these marginalized lives, are really not considered at all within Egypt. And especially as someone it's been some time since they visited Egypt, uh, I found it very fascinating that I've never heard of this before. And so I decided that this would be the play that I wanted to write, and that I titled the play "How the Drowned Become Water" because I think to me these lives, I really just wanted to center on them and to see how far I can take it. And so this is going to be just a small excerpt of the piece, but this is also in a way I kind of tried to utilize my background within poetry to see if I'm able to uh, incorporate it and make it communicate with my playwriting. And so here's how the reading of the prologue within How the Drowned Become Water goes. Prologue, How the Drowned Become Water. Night. On stage, a boat is floating in a river. On the boat, a person whose figure can't be made is alone. Maybe a man or a woman. All we see is their silhouette. The person just stares at the water. We hear the music of the river, the ripples, the insects, the wind singing. A moment, two moments. The person kneels, we hear them sob, soft but sharp. Suddenly, the person stands and the boat sways. They catch balance. Taking one more glance, a mental decision having been made, the person silently slips into the water. There is no struggle, there is no more movement, no sound. The boat stills itself. Silence. This introduction, to this prologue to the piece, to me, I really wanted to see if I was able to incorporate my background within poetry, within playwriting. And to me, even though the forms are, if you think about it, they're very different and they kind of fill in, they kind of like two separate audiences. I found it very fascinating to incorporate them together. And so, and also, what I found very important was that within writing itself, what's important is the brevity of writing. Sometimes you just need a setting and a character and just an action, and that will speak volumes of the work itself. And so I wrote the prologue of How Did John Become Water, not really knowing where it was going to go. Because I'm the type of writer who I don't really enjoy plotting my stories. I'm very character centric with how I approach my writing. I want my characters to be able to speak about their stories, about their pursuits, about their passions, about their guilts. And to me, How Did John Become Water, I wanted just the story to be a character study of what happens. And so the prologue is that introduction to How Did John Become Water. And I found it very fascinating just to explore that process. And for any emerging writers who are here, I think it's very important that just to experiment with your writing, because I did not ever imagine myself really writing plays or any pieces of playwriting. And I just found the process riveting. In a way, it was able to focus me just on what would be presented on the stage and to really incorporate my background within poetry and to see how that intersects and interacts with playwriting was something so fascinating. And I really enjoyed this so much. And like I said before, my behavior of not really focusing on one thing at the same time uh, kind of led to my introduction within fiction writing. And to me, fiction writing was something so powerful. Like, I think to me, that's where I found myself at the most urgency. Because to me, I think poetry, like there's some constraints that could come with it. And at the same time, with playwriting, you're really designated to what's going to be on the stage of your play. But for fiction writing, the whole space itself opened up. I could do whatever I wanted to do within the art, within the form. And for me, I think I was able to incorporate something that I found deeply fun about writing. Because when I was growing up, I found myself really drawn into folk tales, into mythology. When I was younger, my mother, this was during the time when I was watching Sesame Street. My mother at night, she would sing to me Arabic nasheeds or folk tales or mythologies. And she would try to do this to really center my understanding of both the Arabic story and the American story. And so at this time, I found myself even now really drawn to mythology, into folk tales. And I really wanted to experiment with how folk tales and mythology, how could they intersect into the contemporary, into the setting of now. And so I wrote this. This is the short story that I'm currently working on. It's titled Zamelik's Wings, and this excerpt is part of a larger section. But I think to me, this is the kind of work that I want to focus my writing on now, which is magical realism, which is grabbing the ordinary and making it into the extraordinary, into the fantastical, and how that fantastical aspect of it really just kind of describes the situation or the setting. And so this piece, this introduction to this piece, tries to center on that a lot. And let me see if I can share my screen one more time. All right, there we go. So I think you all should be able to see it. This piece is titled Zamelik's Wings. And to me, I wanted to focus on a story that takes place in Brooklyn that incorporates magical realism and centers on an Arabic family. I wanted to get a story that kind of encapsulated the feeling of being birthed in Brooklyn. And with that thought in mind, this is the story that emerged. Zamelik's Wings. The hour he first learned of the wings, the snow had begun drowning the streets with the color of milk. Jibril Musfeh had just come out of a 10-hour shift from managing his own delicatessen. The store, which on the recommendation of his local imam, who possessed a stressful English, was titled in red weather-beaten lettering, Musfih's Dali of life. This was a mistake a lumbering passerby would believe to be a result of Jibril's shortcoming, and to the more imaginative passerby, his deliberate and clever tribute to art. But to Jibril, this was accidental, a mistake he has neither fully realized nor regretted. To him, these were trivial matters that served as life's distractions. His only concern now was the expected birth of his firstborn son. Any moment now, my child will be blossoming into this new world of wonder and magic, Jibril thought. Oh my, what an event that would be. Even as he shouldered his way through the unholy snow, he could not contain the yellow grin surfacing on his face. As he pushed on, he gripped tightly in his right hand a plastic bag filled with week old oranges. Around a month ago, Jibril started reading speculative articles, magazines, and journals to help prepare his wife to give labor in the coming month. One of these magazines suggested that it is crucial to integrate oranges into a pregnant woman's diet to ensure that the baby does not emerge with any head abnormalities or a weak skull. A strong-headed child is a determined one, so Jibril began collecting leftover oranges from the delicatessen to feed them to his wife before her due date. She ate so many orange slices that her skin began to permeate with the intoxicating spell of citrus. This is for our son, Jibril would tell her. He will grow up stronger than the two of us combined. As his Timberland boots crunched small craters into the blanket of snow beneath him, he looked at the oranges encased in their supermarket plastic. Soon he would bear a legacy that outlived him. Crossing the corner into 75th Street, Jibril dug through the contents of his pockets for the key to his brownstone, the numbness of his fingers in the warmth of his thighs. He took out the key, walked to the front of his address, leaned onto the black railing for balance, and climbed up the frozen stoop. Finding his grounding, he slipped and twisted the key into the door lock's mechanism. The cold has always found a way to tense and grab the turning of the metal, one of the many subtle adaptations Jibril began to grow accustomed to when he first settled in America 5 years prior. After a few attempts and wiggles, the lock released and clicked open. Tapping off the residue from his boots and coat, he stepped in, closing the door behind him. Yamina, I made it home. I got some snacks for you if you're hungry, Jibril said as he set the bag of oranges to the floor. Some of the snow on him began to slush and drip all over the spice oak flooring. Jibril sighed, knowing fully well that his wife would not let him go to sleep that night until the mess was soaped and mopped to a commercial shine. The inside of 136 was modest and spare. The space was simple and reflective. A couch, a television set, a table occupied by the finest household china, a tiny kitchen in the back, a carpeted staircase leading to the upper floor, and Islamic decorations, a portrait of the Kaaba, red and brown tinged Arabian fabrics, and a street-painted piece of Arabic calligraphy that read, Allah, hung about the walls. Up above, the faint sound of a running shower echoed throughout the building's pipes. But now, Jibril caught his mouth salivating to the fragrance of a pot full of stuffed grape leaves. The last meal he ate was a hearty club sandwich during his lunch break, so the thought of dinner rushed to him to change out of his clothes and wash up. Jibril removed his boots, slithered off his socks, and placed his coat on the nearby rack. Walking up to the second floor, Jibril realized the oddness of his wife's evening shower. Typically, she would hold off bathing until the end of the day, not this early. As Jibril entered the room and began to change out of his work clothing, he stared at the bathroom door connected to his room. It was then that he noticed two particular occurrences that answered his mental suspicions. The steam of the hot shower beginning to creep and twine into like a haze into the space of his bedroom, and the voice of an unfamiliar person booming with the blaze of fireworks from beyond that closed door. That can't be right, he thought. Another person uninvited in the confines of his restroom. Did Mina summon someone without his knowing? Or was something more shameful at play here? No, she would never do something like that without consulting him first. Would she? The mind is the greatest trickster. So to ensure that he was not jumping to any premature conclusions or illusions, Jibril approached the door and placed his ear on its surface. The shower was tearing a downpour of gems whose names can twist a tongue. Howlite, alabaster, amethyst, moonstone, sapphire. And that noise, distant and exploding, unseen within that bath, the roar of a stranger, the sound of my child, Jibril realized. He is arriving. With a violent hurry and excitement, Jibril opened the door. The scene before him unfolded like a prophecy. Everything here begins with blood and water until they change the pulse of their names. And then a mother. There was his motionless wife holding intimately to her bosom an infant creature, and all around the restroom inhabited an entanglement of red vines and misty serpents. The air carried the power of a dumbbell to the lungs, and the floor was gestating a puddle of water with tiny droplets of crimson. And that sweet aroma, one so acquainted with Jibril, was hanging so brightly like a piece of the moon within this incantation. Licking his chapped lips, the flavor came first to Jibril's taste buds. Week old oranges, the same ones he would bring home with haste from his delicatessen. Yes, there is magic tonight, and there are curses too. As he approached his wife's body, the red vines trickled down and stained the porcelain bathtub. The marble floor tiles were flowing with swimming serpents. These did not catch Jibril's attention, not right away at least. What struck him was the sight of the crying boy's wrinkled and perverse anatomy. The bare pink forelimbs of wings that had sprouted on the hazel soil of his back. As Jibril stared quietly, the baby continued wailing, not yet knowing the nature of his miraculous predicament. Soon his name would be Zamalek. This short story, at least the beginning of the short story, I kind of wanted to. This was actually kind of a blending of sorts. I wanted to tell a story in which I would relate to, and that focused on the themes that I found very personal, and in the sense that I wanted a story to take place in a Brooklyn apartment, one similar to the one that I grew up in when I was a child, one that focused on trying to bring the supernatural with the natural, in the sense that I could use the poetic language that I've taught myself to get used to and see if I could incorporate it within short fiction. And most importantly, I wanted the story to focus on an Arabic family, one that was living in Brooklyn, one that was getting used to life here in America, and one in which it told their stories authentically and truthfully. And so I wrote Zamalek's Wings in a way with that type of urgency. Want to tell an authentic story about Arabic American life and how dynamic it could be. I wanted to fill in that space that I could not, that back in high school, I couldn't really relate to. I wanted to fill in that space so that there could be a type of story, a type of Arabic American story in which it told the lives of Arabic American people. And so these are the types of formats, these are the types of writings that I myself as an artist try to focus on. I focus on fiction, on playwriting, and in poetry. And even though that they're all divided, I try to incorporate elements of each within each other so that their elements could seep together and that they could unify into telling a story as dynamically and as rhythmically and as magically as possible. And so, if it would be possible to put up the screen again. Oh, next page, please. And so for me, uh, I wanted a story, a collection of books of sorts. I really want to interact within their spaces. For me, I think acknowledging the diversity of literature is very important. And I wanted to incorporate myself within that diversity of literature. During my time, even now, I am deeply inspired by global literature as a whole. From African American literature to Asian literature, to Arabic literature to Spanish literature, I try to seek out these works because when I was doing my undergraduate degree, they were not readily available to me. In a way, when I was taking my courses back in college, I kind of had to seek out professors who would teach this type of work because naturally it was not implemented within the course curriculum. And so for me as an author, I try to develop the type of works that I do and try to put it into communication with the works that have inspired me. And so, firstly, I would recommend to you all to try to diversify your diet of literature, which means try to seek out writings from areas in which you don't recognize that well within the space of literature. In the beginning, like I told you all when I was back in high school, I was only fed a diet of European literature. But now I try to engage with literature globally. Most recently, I just recently read a novel talking about life in Japan. And to me, just I'm not very familiar with Japanese society. And just seeing how the approach of the author and how they discussed about femininity, society, and its likes within literature was fascinating because first off, I got to explore a type of space and a type of society that I am not familiar with. But at the same time, I was also able to engage greatly with the characters within that story. It honestly gave me a stronger understanding and a stronger philosophy of those types of people. And to me, I think this is what the point of literature is that it gives you a new viewpoint, a new perspective to look through and to engage with and to empathize and sympathize with. And so I'm going to try to segue right now into if any of you all are emerging writers or people who want to get into publishing or just want to want to understand a greater career within literature, I'm going to try to engage with that a little bit right now. And for me, for those who are emerging writers, my first advice for you would be to be persistent. You know, you have to resist the people telling you that maybe you should pursue something else. If you're truly passionate about your field, I recommend that you commit to it in a way that it's realistic and reasonable, but also so that you could see progress within yourself and within your work. I know in the beginning when I was writing, I found myself greatly struggling to see like if I could really pursue this as a career. And I think that's one of the most nerve-wracking things to think of as a writer is like, can I do this? Can I afford to do this? But when I stayed persistent with it because I knew that I really wanted to focus on this space, and luckily it was able to pay off. And so for emerging writers, my first advice would be to be persistent with it, but also to try to expand your reading. Because to me, there's almost a synergy between writing and reading. To me personally, this is my viewpoint, but I don't believe you could be a good writer without being a good reader. And so for me, just having that interaction between the two, having that synergy, it in a way teaches you. There's a hidden influence between the lines of those two, of reading and writing, and that if you're able to pick up on that, you will notice that your writing improving, growing stronger, and you'll be developing your own voice within that space. And I think that's very important, especially for emerging writers. And for people who are interested within becoming writers and within publishing, for emerging writers, I think this is like the most asked about question. At least like one of the biggest questions that I've came across. And within publishing, um, I found myself in the beginning, and I began trying to publish my work back in my sophomore year of college. And in the beginning, that came with a lot of rejection. And the reason why was because I think at the time I was still trying to find my voice in the manner of which I told stories. And I think this is a natural process. One of my professors, he is a poet and a writer. And I remember that he completed a collection of poetry. And he told me that he submitted that piece of that collection of poetry to 70 publishing houses and got rejected 70 times before he was able to get his work published. And then afterwards, he was able to win a Pulitzer Prize for poetry, which is, at least like in America, that's one of the biggest prizes of writing that you could ever get. And so it's really just try. So basically, within publishing, especially, is that you need to keep at it. You know, if these people believe that your work won't fit into one spot, send it to other people, because I'm pretty sure that someone out there, if you write good writing, that someone will pick it up, and that will help you further your name, further the stories that you want to tell, and would help in a way create the foundation in which you could pursue a career within writing. And in regards to careers within writing, I think that, at least for me, I found writing in the beginning, but because of writing, I was able to find careers within activism, within advocacy, and within nonprofit work. And in a way, being a writer, because typically when people think of writers, they think about like pursuing a degree within writing or within language, and then afterwards just immediately becoming a teacher. And while this is a possible, and I think this is a respectable career path if someone wants to pursue it, uh, I also think it's very important that there are still a bunch of avenues within literature, within writing, that you could pursue within a career. And for me, I found myself that I was able to engage with a bunch of organizations that try to promote art. And to me, as a writer, I think it's very essential that you are very observant, you know, to pursue career paths that you might not be familiar with. Because at the time, I was not really familiar with nonprofit organizations and within artist organizations. And so for me to really find work within the nonprofit spaces, I was able to incorporate some of those elements within my work, while at the same time advocating for what I truly believe is important, which is diversification of literature. And so within writing especially, I think it's essential for a writer to be very observant, to be very aware, because that will definitely feed the topics and the themes, sometimes even the characters of your works. And so I truly believe that that pursuing writing and literature as a career is very possible. Like you, in a way, I think just the act of pursuing that as a career helps enlist you in a way of being a great thinker and a great speaker. And in sorts, it helps you also realize what's very important to you within life and how to engage with that. And so for me, there's definitely like a lot of things that writers could do um, as a career path, but I truly believe that it's very possible that writers could pursue work in advocacy, within I can't speak, activism, and writing as a whole. And it's definitely sustainable too. That's one thing that people don't really recognize, that pursuing a career as someone who's a literary scholar or who's an academic or who is a writer, it is a sustainable field of work. It's just that you need to put that effort in to ensure that it stays sustainable. Oh yeah, and then next slide, please. Yeah, and I think that essentially kind of tackles the list of some of the main things that I did want to discuss about. But I definitely want to have a conversation with you all to see like if there may be any questions, anything that any thoughts or any ideas that you guys want to discuss about. It's definitely an open floor for me, so I'm more than happy to chat more about it.
So, hi Anes, how are you?
I'm doing great
Thank
as well.
you very much for your words. I think that, well, your words were magnificent. And now we are going to enter in this section. If you have any comment, if you have any doubt, you can let us know here in the chat, or you can open your mic. So, this is the moment to interact with Anes. So, well, I can start. I would like to ask you, Anes, um, which is your favorite, let's say, work? It can be a poem, a short story, or whatever you have already done. So,
That's honestly, I think to be that's probably the most difficult question because that's so tough. Which one to pick? Um, oh wow. Yeah, this is honestly always the one question that stumbles me because like one day I might have a favorite piece of writing, and then the next day it switches to another piece of writing. But today I could definitely recommend a. There's a book that I'm reading right now. It's by an author. Her name is Ruth Ozeki, and the piece is called "A Tale for the Time Being." And I began reading this work, and it is absolutely fascinating. It's a fascinating novel to really understand and to really interact with, and it deals with themes that are very serious, but at the same time is very whimsical. And so I would definitely recommend A Tale for the Time Being as one of my favorite works at the current moment.
Hi. Um, how do you feel once you look back into all the work you've done? Like when you look to your first, I can remember the word right now, but your first like essay, for to give it a name, I can figure the word out right now.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. If I look back at some of the first pieces of writing that I wrote, um, I would say a little bit embarrassed. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, I think like my writing back in the day, it was a little. I think it was obvious that if you read it, it was a little bit of. It was obvious that I was still trying to uh, figure out writing and to really understand my voice, and because of that, the writing itself, it wasn't there yet. Uh, but then, like over the years, I think I was able to see a sort of development with that writing. And so in the beginning, even though I'm very embarrassed about it, and I think one of my friends would be able to tell you that I deleted the file of that work because I did not want to see it again, because that's how embarrassed I was of it. But now, though, the catalog of work that I'm pursuing, I am deeply proud of it, though, because I think to me, it was essential for my development as a writer, but also it's something that it does actually focus on what I really want to focus on as a writer.
Good afternoon. Um, I'm wondering if you've ever had a problem finishing your writing projects, and if you had, what sort of advice do you have for someone with the same problem?
Mm. Now, that's a really good question. First off, to answer the first part of that question, I have it all the time. Just a couple of days ago, even like I was writing a piece of short fiction, and I found myself confused on where I want to take it. And for me, I think especially as a writer, it's you'll definitely have that feeling of stuckness in a way, and because of that, like you might not be able to finish a work or a couple of works. And to me, how I would the advice I would do to really counteract this is that if you do recognize that a piece of yours that isn't working, or like at least that you're stuck on, or like you can't complete, what I would recommend is give yourself distance from the piece. And what I mean by that is basically give yourself time. Because I remember some of the works that I wrote, I was stuck on them and I did not know what to do about it. So what I did in response to this was that I waited a full week, did not look at the work, avoided it at all costs. And when I came back to that work a week later, I was able to see it very differently. And I knew how I wanted to approach it now. So what I would recommend is give yourself distance from your piece or your piece of writing. And then over time, when you interact with it, it could be very differently. That interaction could be very different, and that it could actually help you progress the piece further. You just give yourself some time some time distance from the piece itself to help you figure out what you want to do with it.
Thank you very much.
Anes, how can you describe like your creative process when you're going to figure it out, for example, the characters and the plot? How can you write your poems, in this case, your creative process?
That's a really good question. So for me, I'm the type of writer who I don't think of plot at all. Like I don't think I have like maybe like ideas that I could incorporate within like the story itself, but the idea of plot never really hits with me until like all the way at the end when I complete a piece. What I really focus on as a writer is characters. I think for me, any story that I write is very character driven, and so what I wait for that kind of strike of inspiration of sorts. And sometimes I find the characters that I want to write about. I find them in my personal life usually. I remember like that story of Zemelik's Wings, like that segment that I was reciting a while ago. The father of that story had elements that I was inspired about by my father. Like that story, like the character was an immigrant, was someone who was still kind of struggling to make a living in America. And he's still freshly immigrated here. So like he's still kind of understanding the spaces in which he understands. And so for me as a writer, I try to first off understand my characters. I try to find through my personal life, through like just maybe even like through public life, like it's really just trying to be observant about stuff that really stick out to you. And then afterwards, it's basically just write a page or so and see where that goes. And for me, I just simply just write the first page and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I could incorporate this element to the story, or maybe I could put in this situation to see how this character would interact with it. And then from there, at least for me, the story would progress, and then I would edit it and then draft it. And in the end, hopefully it will be fully realized and will do what I initially hoped it would do, while at the same time evolving the story greatly. And so for me, it's just really just seeking out small bits of inspiration to incorporate it within the characters of the story.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
And which is your favorite genre? And when you began writing, did you start with the same genre that you're writing right now, or you have multiple genres to write about?
No, that's a really good question. Genre. That's a really good question. To me, I kind of, when I approach at least reading or like the type of genres that I really enjoy, I kind of don't, if this makes sense, like I don't look for genre. I kind of rather I just try to see if I could relate to the story itself. Near me right now, I actually have a library of books, and they're very very different from one another. They focus on different types of genre, like they all possess different types of genres and different stories and different characters and different settings. And so for me, I know like I'm heavily drawn to more magical realist works, or like elements that incorporate more of folktale or more uh, fantastical types of ideas. But the type of works that I consume, because I think it's important as a writer, especially as a writer, that you need to be a very open-minded reader. And what that means is that is kind of don't pigeonhole yourself into just one type of genre. It's kind of reading a bunch of different types of genres all together, and that could help fuel the type of ideas in your mind and the type of approaches you want within your own work. And so for me, even though I like to focus more on the fantastical elements of writing, I do read, realist novels. Sometimes, if I'm really feeling it, read like a horror piece of writing and see what elements of those writings I really enjoy, and then incorporate those elements within my writing.
I have a question, Anes. You know that as a literature teacher, I am very focused on structure because basically I teach my students like, all the elements of fiction, elements of the plot, elements of nonfiction and poetry and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
So it is very like revealing to me to find this process of this creative process that you writers go through to create the stories that I analyze through a structure.
Mhm.
So my question here is, has it ever happened to you since, like, as you mentioned that you do not work on the plot, but you let your characters take you to where the story would go. Has it ever happened to you that maybe you do not like the way or the direction it is taking? And what do you do in that case? What would you do? Because I think that I would totally freak out.
No, I completely understand that. That's very relatable. And I think like three ideas just popped up in my mind as you were speaking. And first off, on the idea of structure, as a writer, I was taught this back in when I was taking classes as an undergraduate. And to me, one of the teachers told me, if you want to break structure of like your writing and try to like be a little bit experimental with it, you need to understand structure first. And especially like this was during the time when I was doing poetry, and sometimes poems could be very structured. There are villanelles, there are sonnets, there are haikus, there are a bunch of different types of poetic forms. But I was taught that you need to understand those forms first to understand them fully before you could break down the structure and experiment with them. And so I kind of took that philosophy within all my types of writings. And in the terms of like if I'm writing a story and I focus more on the character and the story kind of segues into something else, the way how I counteract that personally is that I have some close friends to me who I make sure that they read the writing first. And because to me, I think the issue with being a writer, like at least like writing like a piece of like a story or like a piece of short fiction, is that you kind of become blindsided in a way because you don't realize how your work will be interpreted by another person. And so for me, I have a few close friends who I make sure that they read the work and to see what their interpretation of it is. I remember even the piece of Melik's Wings. At some point later in the story itself, um, I was chatting with my friend about it, and there was like just like this moment that did not fit within like the story itself. So I would edit that whole entire section and revise it completely. And so for me, uh, if I get stuck like I usually like freak out a little bit, but then I kind of contain myself in the sense that part of the process of writing is editing and it's drafting. Like a story could go through maybe even like 12, 13 drafts before it's fully realized. And so as a writer, it's really important to recognize that it's not going to be perfect right away, but it will take time for that story to really fit into like the bones of its of like the story itself. And so for me, it's really just understanding basically how public interpretation would be of that story, and how could I fix it up so it could seem seamless and it could work as a story as a whole.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Hi, I have a question.
Mhm.
You said that you are a writer that centers around characters, and there has been a time that you are writing an unlikable main character. If though it was on purpose or just happened.
Mhm. That's a good question. So when I write a character, if they happen to be likable, I'm very happy about that. But when I do write a character, um, I don't necessarily write them in the mind that I want them to be likable. Rather, I write them, at least like in my mind, I write them to be as realistic as possible. And so, because like you do definitely want to show the humanity of your characters, but at the same time, you also want to show the inhumanity of your characters, because then that kind of develops. It's kind of that big question of uh, good versus evil, white versus black. In a way, it's kind of like you want to find that gray space between them. And so for me, finding that gray space between them, it kind of gives more complexity to the character. It gives more, first off, it makes it more seem more realistic. And to me, as a storyteller, I think that's one thing that I strive within my characters the most, is to show like their pros and their cons. But also, I think it also sets up very good interactions for the situations that they could be in within the story. It's really just trying to fully fledge them as a character that is neither good nor bad, but that very gentle in between. And so if they're likable, I'm very happy about that. Uh, and but that's not necessarily what I aim for the most. What I aim for the most is make sure that I could actually, if I met this person in real life, they actually seem like a character. They actually seem like they would be like a real life person, rather than just this type of than just floating like in space of like this type of like. It's kind of like how would I explain it? That like this would be an actual person I could actually meet in real life, versus someone who it's quite obvious that like they don't seem realistic enough, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much.
Anes, we have a question here in the chat. I'm going to read it. And Paola is asking, how can we go deeper into the characters?
Mhm.
What should we take into account?
That's a good question. For me, I'll answer the second question in 1 second. So for me, what I find very important into developing a character is that every story needs to have a situation in which it challenges the character. And so for me as a writer, I already have this idea of a character in mind. I remember like for the play that I read like the short prologue of. Later on, it talks about the grief of the family living on the Nile, and I think to me one of the most complex characters within that story is the father of the story, because to me I initially started the character off as that there's a lot of guilt that the character is dealing with. And to me, to really find that complexity within that character, I needed to put him in a situation in which it could, first off, it changes, by the end of the story, it changes the character a little bit. Like you could sense a shift within the character's personality, or the way he interacts, or just the way he engages with other people. And so for me, I try to find those very interesting situations in which I believe, in a way, challenges the character, both their morality, uh, both their sociability, both also their personal lives. Just find a situation in which it pushes your character to the limits, and then in the end of the story, see if that character changes, because that whole progression of the character in the beginning of the story all the way to the end of the story, that's very fascinating, and that's why I try to do it the most, to really dig deeper into the character studies of the people who I try to create. Oh, and to also answer the other question that was just put in the chat, I've ever English. I have, but I'm not that good at translation yet. I do speak Arabic fluently. I'm able to read, write, and speak it. And I definitely, some of the works that I wrote, I definitely wrote Arabic for them. I definitely but to me, I find it more fascinating. I am very fascinated with translation. I am not very adept at it yet. I'm still working on it, but I have, in a way, incorporated within my work both Arabic and English at the same time. Because to me, because my goal as a writer is that I definitely want to talk about the Egyptian-American experience. And so what I find works the most with that is that I don't only just write in English. I also put segments in Arabic as well. And I don't explain it. I just write the segments in Arabic. Because to me, that duality of bilingualism that I grew up with is something that I want to see reflected within my writing itself. And so for me, I try to incorporate both at the same time and see how they blend together. But I definitely do want to translate more of my works in English to Arabic. I'm not fully adept to that point, because translation also comes with, you need to have a knack for metaphor, for rhythmic schemes within the other language, and just you have to have a fully understood scope of that. And while I am fluent within Arabic, I don't think I had that ear yet to really interact fully within the fictional realms of writing, or the poetic realms of writing. So I'm working on that, but I am not there yet.
I have another
So
question.
I have.
Oh, no, don't worry.
Go
Don't worry.
ahead.
Oh, okay.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead. Don't worry.
Okay. There is a book that the characters, you like it so much that you grow so attached to them, like a really good character-driven book.
Oh, yes, yeah. It tends to, most of the books that I read, sometimes they're plot driven, but usually they're very heavily character driven. And I usually find that if you really want to find character driven books, try to find books that are written in the first person. That book that I was talking about earlier, called A Tale for the Time Being, that book is written in the first person, and it is fascinating. It gives you such a dynamic look into their life and their personal thoughts as well, going through their lives. But also, I have found some third person perspective books. A great example is How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pam Zhang. And that book is fascinating because that whole book is an exploration on two characters who are related with one another, and how that they just survive across the landscape of America. And for me, first off, it has a setting of it definitely puts them in a situation, but it also tries to strive on developing that character as fully fledged as possible. And so for me, typically when I read a book, it goes in either first person or third person, but it definitely focuses mostly on the character themselves. If there happens to be a plot, I think it kind of sits on the back burner, because they put the character usually at the front and foremost, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that my question is a little basic, but I think that it is important to know. And who is your favorite author, in this case, writer?
That's another hard question. My favorite author. I definitely have been. I am definitely heavily influenced by a lot of authors. Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian author that I brought up during the presentation, he is someone I look up to greatly. I think he was the first inspiration that I have. Toni Morrison, she's an African American author, and she is superb. She taught me how to incorporate magical realism within American settings. So for me, she definitely stands there the most as one of my most influential authors. Ocean Vuong, he's a poet and a fiction writer too, and his poetry, if you ever have the chance to read it, definitely read it because it's so sublime and so moving. Like I've every poem that I've read of his, at the end of it, I felt myself transported in a way. And I think as a reader, that's the most important thing to get out of it. So there's definitely Ocean Vuong, Salman Rushdie, Chikozi Obiyoma, uh, uh, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. These are the authors that I read their works with fascination, and they definitely, but at the end of their works, I definitely feel like within a different space. And I think for me, those are just some of my favorite authors, and that list could go on and on, but that would take too long. So, but those are some of like my major authors that I definitely look up to for sure.
Thank you. Wonderful.
I have another question, and this is maybe it's a little out of your league, but I figured I'd try at least. So you have written poetry, plays, and also novels, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I was wondering if someone, if a writer, could also write for many different types of of works like this, but like in another sense. Like for example, if someone could write maybe novels, but also like films or TV shows or that sort of thing. You think that that's possible? That for a writer to diversify themselves like that?
Yeah, yeah. I remember, at least for me, like at some point, I became fascinated with film. Like I am a big movie buff. For me, like at least during my undergraduate degree, at some point, I even took classes to see how I could get into film. Film was a little harder for me to, at least for me, like it was a bit hard to get into, but I definitely think it's possible. Even sometimes, like in passing, I would read maybe like a screenplay of like a famous piece of film, and to me, I think even though like it's a very different space, um, I do think that you could learn a lot from it. And I've seen many writers, from playwriting to fiction to poetry, who also dug their toes into film. And to me, I think, especially like within like the writing process of film as well, um, it's kind of similar to fiction in which you have the whole space for yourself. Um, and also like it has some aspects of play in which like you also need to be able to fit it in the setting. But what I find very fascinating about film, especially as a writer, is that when you're writing like a screenplay or something akin to a screenplay, it isn't visualized yet. And I think like the real fascinating thing about it is that you kind of give visualization to the writing itself after you're done completing like the screenplay. Um, so for me, I definitely think it's, first off, I encourage writers to dig their toes into like whatever type of writing they want to get into. Filmmaking, film and filmmaking itself is very fascinating. And as a writer, you shouldn't feel obligated to just write into like one type of form. If you want to experiment within film, definitely dig your toes within film and see if you enjoy it. And if you enjoy it, maintain your practice within screenwriting. And that advice goes to like all forms of writing as a whole. Really just try to discover yourself in which forms that you find enjoyable to you the most, and which you could see yourself with the most progression with. and then afterwards, that's just a matter of maintenance. And seeing film is a little bit like more like you need to have like funding to like let's say like film like a piece of a visual piece, but definitely put that effort in there too, so that you can ensure that your writing itself, blossoms into like the way how you want it to blossom to. So definitely, like if you're a writer and you're interested in film, definitely dig your toes in film too.
Thank you again.
No problem.
I have another question, and is if when you're writing, obviously you are in your feelings, and are you never afraid of showing like this vulnerable side of you to the world, like in your writing, to get people to know your vulnerable side?
No, that's a really good question, and I think for me, I'm kind of the opposite of that. In which I'm not afraid to like at least like within my writing, I'm not afraid to show my vulnerable side. As a matter of fact, I think I write to show that vulnerable side because to me, I think it kind of gives like a interesting dynamic to the writing itself. And for me, I think writing itself is a vulnerable act. It's only you and the page, and whatever you end up doing with it, um, you're putting that out into the world, and it has your ideas in it. It has your characters. It has things that you like. As if you once you begin writing, and from the beginning of writing to like the end where like it gets published, in a way, all these ideas that you have brimming throughout like your time of writing that piece will have to be sent out at some point to the world, and that to me is a very vulnerable act itself, and that comes with like the emotions of like I can't touch this work anymore. It's out there. And to me, I think that's very fascinating. And I try to, and even though I know, like once I send out like a piece of writing like to the world, um, and and even though I become vulnerable, I'm like, oh, okay, my writing has these types of ideas that I'm like, I'm not sure how like people would react to. But to me, I think that's the point of writing. It starts up that type of discussion, that type of discussion between people within the works itself, and to see your viewpoints while also developing theirs. And I think that's the goal of being a writer, is to show it's in a way, it's a vulnerable act, uh, and to be able to present that vulnerable act to the world. So yeah, absolutely. And I'm not afraid of it. I myself, I encourage it. It's a very courageous act to do. And to me as a writer, it's definitely a necessary thing that every writer will have to come across, is to be willing to be vulnerable and to show that vulnerability out to the world.
A little bit related to that last question, I was wondering, have you ever written about any controversial topics? And if so, well, obviously writing about such things can be scary, especially nowadays where social media makes worldwide communication so instant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you've ever done it, and if you have, then how do you avoid feeling this fear, right? To show these controversial ideas to the world.
No, that's a really good idea. That's a really good question. For me, I'm trying to think of what's the most controversial I've written. Like I've definitely like I know at some point, at least like when I first began writing poetry, I did it in a way. I wrote poems in a way as a political act, to voice my concerns with what was happening to Egypt years ago, especially during the Arab Spring revolutions. I definitely focused a lot of my work during that time, and that might be considered the most controversial. And I definitely have had some like more other controversial ideas that I wanted to incorporate with my writing to see how I could interact with that. And so yeah, definitely like I've either written a few works that have dealt with controversial themes, and I've definitely have some ideas and I'm probably going to write them at some point just to see how it goes like. And for me, I think, especially as a writer, what I find a little sad is that some people, I've seen a couple of writers that have inspired me. They've written controversial works, or they've talking about controversial themes, and the issue is that people have a very there's a difference between being agreeing with a piece and disagreeing with a piece versus being a bit radical in regards to the piece itself. You know, I myself as a writer, like if I disagreed with a piece of writing that I've read, I don't go out shaming it in front of everyone else or say that it's a very damaging piece of writing, or I don't even try to damage the author itself. If I disagree with a piece of writing, I try to understand where my disagreement lies and then try to have a continual dialogue with it versus, you know, I know like we're all living like in the social media age and people kind of get a little bit instant with their reaction to things. But I think this comes like, as a writer, you need to be resistant of that type of push from other people if it's not valid, you know. And by being resistant to that kind of push, first off, you need to understand as a writer that you're creating art, and you need to see where that audience for your art lies in. Some people just look at your writing and then just try to like shame you on it, and they don't give anything critical or constructive to bring into the table, versus people who actually do bring something constructive and critical to the table, and that you could have that dialogue with them. So as a writer, if you write something controversial or something like that, you need to understand where your audience lies in and try to have that dialogue with them versus, you know, the people who might be a bit too aggressive or too radical within their critique of your work, or within their shaming of your work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And that thing you mentioned about shaming a piece of writing or worse, an author for their ideas. Yeah. I've seen it happen a lot, and it's why I asked the question. One example that I've seen a lot is, for example, Lovecraft. Yeah. Everyone says that it's not worth reading Lovecraft because he's a racist, but like he invented a whole genre of horror, right? So I think his writings are important.
Mm. Yeah, Lovecraft's writing is very hard to read to begin with because it's very it's Lovecraft. That's the best way to respond to it. But for me, even I've read his writing back in high school, and to me, this might be like my personal view, but I try to separate the art and the artist. Some people might view that differently. Some people might merge the two as in a way they're kind of reflective of each other. But for me, I like to separate it to see the work for the work and the person for the person. And so for me, like Lovecraft might be a great example. I'm not too sure on his personal background, so I'm not too sure how to comment on that specifically. But I've seen authors like, let's say, like Salman Rushdie or Orhan Pamuk or people like that who people have reacted quite intensely to their work, you know. And to me, like, I think Naguib Mahfouz said it the best, you know, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said that even though he disagrees with the work, no writer should be like threatened with harm or like with malicious intent towards their work. Because I'm not, and to me, I agree with that. I could have a disagreement with the work itself, but I do not wish any harm to the person who wrote it. You know, it's very important to understand those lines. And the issue with the social media age now is that people tend not to understand those lines a lot, and they kind of merge the two together. And to me, I try to separate the artist and the art completely. And so in the case of Lovecraft, even though I'm not sure about his history, I have read his work before. And even though his work, the writing itself is a bit confusing, he did, at least like for the horror genre of writing, he did do something very interesting with it. And so like I could definitely see like what you mean by that for sure.
Right, I agree. Thank you.
So I have another question. And this one is a little more personal. So as a writer, how do you deal with criticism? Because to be honest, everyone receives this type of comments. So how do you feel with that?
Honestly, this is a funny story when you ask that question. And back when I was doing poetry within college for the first time, I was taking a professor. Her name is Kate Marvin. She's fantastic. I love her. And I remember, and I was and my writing back then, when I said I was embarrassed about it, I was really embarrassed about it looking at it now because I realized how bad my writing was back then. And I remember um, when in our class we usually have a workshop in which we read one of our poems out loud. At least like the writer of the poem reads their poem out loud and then stays quiet, and then everyone around the room discusses about their writing right in front of them so they could understand those criticisms. And I remember uh, she was very critical of my work, but in a constructive way. Like even though at certain moments I was like, oh man, I did a very bad job. She was able to point out what the issues with the work were, what works, what doesn't work, and how to fix that. And for me, even though she was so adamant on that type of criticism, that to me, I kind of welcome criticism in the sense that if it could better the work, I will take it into account and try to incorporate it within the writing of the work itself. Because I think as a writer, uh, it's a bit unrealistic to think that you'll never get criticism. You, as a writer, will absolutely get criticism, and you need to be able to respond with that criticism constructively as well. You know, if the piece of something within the writing doesn't work, you need to fix that. And sometimes getting multiple voices to critique your work is also important as a writer. Because sometimes, like one person's I like to say one person's views on your writing is subjective. But if you get multiple people, then it becomes more objective if they have similar things to say about it. And so for me as a writer, definitely hearing those voices out and not pushing away criticism, but welcoming it and seeing how you could utilize it to the fullest. I think that's very important as a writer.
Perfect. I agree. I think that the feedback is always necessary. So thank you.
Absolutely, no problem.
Although, thinking about it, what happens when you get unconstructive criticism?
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Constructive criticism. Um, yeah, no, I've definitely like in workshops in my classes when I was an undergraduate, I've definitely had people who commented like, you can definitely tell from a person's response if it's constructive or unconstructive. You know, I remember like, and this also comes from good criticism to bad criticism. You know, if I read like a piece of literature from like a colleague, right, and if I responded to it saying, oh, this is good. I like this poem, or like I like this fiction, or I like this play, right? That even though they're saying at its nature it seems nice, it doesn't provide you anything to work with. Same thing with like, oh, this piece, let's say I didn't like it, or it made me feel uncomfortable, or something like that. Um, that also you couldn't really work with it. Like there's no construction to it. But if they dig deeper and said like, oh, I think that this verse works greatly because of the metaphor, the symbolism, or like you maintain a nice rhythmic scheme. Uh, Understanding that you could work with. You're like, okay, so I need to probably maintain that throughout the piece. Or like saying like, oh, this aspect kind of confuses or like muddles the piece because it doesn't fit with the synergy of like the upper line or like the lower line or something like that. Um, that's also constructive. You could actually work with that. So it's really finding something that like uh, that something, and it's not physical, but something that feels physical that you could actually work on versus something that it seems general and you can't really interact with the most. That's how you separate constructive criticism versus just, I wouldn't even call it criticism. I would just call it as just someone just discussing your work aloud.
I see. Thank you.
No problem.
Well, I think that we don't have more questions. So I give the word to our teacher, Michelle Haie. So, teacher, you can go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Anes, I would like to thank you for sharing your journey from Egypt to New York and how it shaped your love for languages and your career as a writer. Your experience and your journey certainly inspire us. Like learning about yourself connects us with our passion and commitment as the best drive behind our actions. Thank you for showing us through examples of your work how literature and creative writing can transform the ordinary into extraordinary, quoting yourself. And I also would like to thank you for being so open and so honest in your answers, and well, for taking the time to have this conversation with us. We really enjoyed a lot learning more about yourself and all the creative process behind all the stories, novels, plays, poems that we read in class. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much all for spending the time with me and just discussing this with me. I'm very appreciative of that for sure.
Great. So I'll pass the word to the students who organized the meeting for them to give their farewells.
Well, Anes, thank you very much for being here to share your experience, your inspiration. I think that it was wonderful, and I am looking forward to reading your words. So, thank you, thank you, thank you. I think that it was a nice experience to have you here. So, well, thank you.
Before you go, I would like to know if I can have access to your contact information, because maybe I would like to share some of your work in my class, and maybe have another meeting like this eventually with my students, because I think that will certainly enrich the program and the curriculum of the class. So I'll make sure that I get your contact information. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day. See you guys very soon, and wonderful meeting you, Agnes. See you around. Bye.
Thank you.